Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Find Biometrics webinar, Building a Passwordless World, presented with Prove. My name is Peter Counter, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Find Biometrics. I'm going to be the moderator for this fireside chat. And today we're going to be talking about a major problem in the world of identity and fraud, and that is passwords. 2023 is a major year for the biometrics and identity industry, because it marks a decade since the introduction of tier one smartphone biometrics like Touch ID, and then as well as many initiatives to kill the password. But knowledge-based authentication is still here, and that's why today we are going to be talking about how our reliance on passwords contributes to the ongoing fraud crisis, why biometrics supported by knowledge-based authentication are not enough to stop password-related fraud, what your organization can do to decrease its reliance on passwords, and also how the identity industry is paving the way forward to a safe, convenient post-password future. It's a lot to talk about. It's a complicated subject, and that's why I'm so pleased that in order to do that, I'm joined by a special guest. Bill Fish is the Vice President of Authentication Products at Prove. Bill, thank you for joining me for this webinar.
No, thank you for having me, Peter. I really appreciate it.
Well, really glad to have you here. I think to start this conversation off, let's start off by trying to understand with our audience the modern password problem. So as I mentioned just there in my introduction, we're going on 10 years here. Many in the identity industry, myself included, have been prematurely declaring the death of passwords. They're obviously still here. They're obviously still broken, but that said, they're not really the same as the old-fashioned 8 characters and a number or symbol that we used to talk about. So my first question to get things started is how have passwords evolved to try and better serve customers, and why are they still vulnerable to the same threats?
Yeah, so passwords have changed, and part of that was even in the early attempts of add a character, add numbers, add all these things, and then what people do is they take the same password and just adapt it to the requirements of that particular website, which it's not hard to guess once you have a root password, right, what the permutations could be based on the requirements of a website. But I think one of the biggest, I guess, advancements in the space was really the introduction of the password manager, right? The ability to because the challenge that you have is you're trying to remember, right? You're counting on users to actually remember. You don't want them to write it down either. It's like you actually have to remember what this thing is. And with the proliferation of 90, 100, some odd, the average number of digital accounts that users have, it's that's going to be impossible to remember that many unique combinations. So the password manager was a pretty big innovation to help users do that. Now, right to this day, I think you're still counting on more power users who use password managers, but that's been a step forward. And then things like using on-device biometrics to log in. But the problem is it doesn't actually replace your password. It doesn't get rid of your password, I should say. The password is still the thing that sits underneath that, but it has made it a little bit more convenient for users to use. But yeah, so I would say password managers really have changed the game a bit to be able to give people unique and hard to break passwords. But there is still a string of characters that gives people access to your account. And until we get rid of those, that's always going to be a remote vulnerability.
Absolutely. And I mean, it really does, from a user perspective, feel completely transformative. The experience of passwords from a user side doesn't feel the same. But that also kind of lines me up for my next question, which is, one of the more dramatic examples of our password dependency and its problems is the 2022 LastPass breach, which further investigations have revealed actually led to hackers compromising password vaults. My question is, what can we learn from the failure of advanced password solutions like these password vaults?
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was saying at the end of the previous statement, is as long as you have a string of characters out there that gives access to your account, it's vulnerable to remote attack. And that's what, a lot of systems are built, I would say the newer, authentication systems are built to try to replace that, to try to get rid of the ability to attack remotely. But as long as it's sitting on that foundation, it's you're building your house on sand, unfortunately. Now you want to firm up your sand a little bit. Yes, you can take steps to do that, but it's still it's not what you want to build a confident structure on. The challenge is, so much is happening digitally for users these days. People, you can, it's a cliche to say, but it's all your money can be accessed online now. So the importance of moving beyond just having a string of characters and capabilities that are vulnerable to remote attack is really important.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking of cliches, I don't know how common this is outside of our industry, but we're always talking about something something you have, and something you are. Yeah. The something with a password vault, it kind of subverts that, because it's no longer something I don't know any of my passwords, but a machine knows it, and that means that it's learnable and therefore usable, right? Yeah. That's the problem with it's still a piece of knowledge. Despite everything going against them, like we're talking about, passwords still persistent. I just mentioned I'm using them. Everybody has to. But my question is, why is it so difficult to move beyond passwords?
Oh, I mean, there are a number of reasons for that. I think it starts off with just it's an embedded experience. Everybody has used them. Everybody knows how they work. It's how the internet's worked for decades, like just thinking about talking to my own parents and trying to get them off of passwords. Well, what do I do? Like that, I think for users who are used to it, it feels vulnerable, even though it's the opposite. It's like, what happens if I lose the thing that I'm relying on? Like, what do those processes look like? Or not those processes to recover an account, for example, are not embedded in people's understanding, and there's a lack of confidence there. But I think the more important thing is, why were passwords used in the first place, which it doesn't require anything for a user other than to remember or to write down on a piece of paper. A lot of the authentication systems that we're talking about that are going to get rid of passwords do rely on a certain amount of hardware and or other sort of capabilities for the user that they may or may not have. So I think that's the big thing is it's relatively easy to use, and it's just how people have done it for all of existence of the internet,
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, when we look at places, industries that have had a great level of biometric adoption for authentication and verification, the first hurdle that they always have to leap over is the convenience factor. They need to make sure that, yes, this has to be easy for people to use, or else they're not going to use it. And when something is so deeply embedded in the infrastructure of our digital world as a password, it's hard to beat how easy it is to implement, and then through familiarity, how easy it is to use, especially when you're just autofilling. But obviously, we've got to do it. So I would like to start digging a little bit deeper into some of the things we're talking about now. So, biometric authentication, it's mainstream now to an extent, thanks to the ubiquity of face and fingerprint authentication on consumer level smartphones. I think most people, that's how they're using it. It's, to get through their lock screen, to authorize a payment on their mobile wallet, sometimes to log into apps, even websites we're starting to see. But these are uniformly marketed as security solutions. That said, they all, you gestured towards this just a little bit earlier, they all have a PIN or passcode account recovery option. And sometimes they're actually just sort of releasing a password. So my question is, how do passwords for account recovery compromise biometric systems?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit. If your recovery method is based on a password. It's the foundation upon which you're building your whole authentication system. So, at the moment of an identity verification event, you establish credentials, like that connectivity, that where you do those things together, that's your foundation for the future for your authentication. So if you're doing that off of the back of a username password combination, and that's your method of recovery, or even if it's a passcode for a device, or whatever it may be, it's a something that's going to be your vulnerability. And I think what the biometrics then become isn't a security benefit as much as it is a user experience benefit, which you said. It's like it makes it easy to log in, and I love logging in with my face, but I don't pretend to think that that's somehow like that much more secure for my account, because if my account can be accessed by a password from somebody else's computer, what did that actually do for me, from a security standpoint, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then obviously there are some cases where, the passcode for a smartphone is actually, technically more secure depending on what state you're in, you can be compelled to use it, etc. But that's a different conversation.
Well, there was that story of Kanye West. I don't know if you saw that, where like on camera, he used his unlock code. It was like 0000. It's like, well, you might want to change that now.
Yes, that was at a basketball game, I believe. That's
yeah,
good.
I think so.
I'll make sure that we link that in the show notes for people to see, because it's still a great example. Speaking of just general usage, we talk about the importance of user education in terms to sort of encourage adoption. How aware do you think the average user is of this vulnerability of a KBA account recovery option for their biometrics?
Yeah, I struggle with this one. Obviously, being in the industry, it's sometimes hard to put like a non-industry hat on and remember what it would have been like to just sort of think about your personal security environment. I don't think that it's something that's at the forefront of people's minds. I think ultimately it's like, I need to get into my account, so I'm going to make a password that I'm going to remember or be able to figure out, without too much hassle. But I think there's something that's a little bit more foundational, which is I think part of the reason is like that people don't take it necessarily that seriously is there's a thought of there are billions of people on the planet. Why would anybody bother attacking me, really? Like, what are they really going to get from me, where they could go after, Elon Musk and try to get, but it's like, it doesn't work like that, right? The fraudsters don't go after the hardened targets as much, and they do, but they go after the low hanging fruit. It's about kind of like, can I get in? No, move on. Can I get in? No, move on. That's the mindset of a lot. Again, not absolutely every fraud situation, but in a lot of fraud scenarios, that's the way they're working through that. So I think the average person oftentimes thinks like, well, what do I really have that a fraudster wants to get at? They want to watch my Netflix, like not a whole lot there, but I think that's a challenge to overcome. It's like, as a user, what you're doing is you're asking them to put barriers up for themselves. And I don't think they really fully always understand, like, what am I protecting? Like,
absolutely.
Why me?
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that fraud is a business. It's not just a bunch of villains out there trying to do bad things. They're trying to make money quickly in a scalable way. And then something you also mentioned about, what are they going to do? Watch my Netflix, or a lot of stand-up comedians are often like, oh, congratulations, you've stolen all of my debt. But at the same time, which I always think is very funny, but at the same time, it's like, well, when they gain access to your account, that's also another vector for social engineering fraud, et cetera, and then you can again scale it. So somebody's account might have a deficit in it, but if you can get into their account, steal their identity, you can use that to get into more accounts, and chances are you'll make some money quickly.
Yeah, well, there's a certain type of fraud that uses that, which generally is focused on taking advantage of vulnerable older people, right? You know, they get into their Facebook accounts, understand their relationships, maybe learn their phone number, and then they send text messages being like, "Oh, hey, it's your granddaughter. I'm in real trouble. Can you wire me some money, or send me some crypto?" I'm like, and when you say them out loud, it sounds like, people shouldn't be falling for that, but learning about somebody's life, being able to repeat back to them things that it makes it very real.
Mhm.
So I don't think you can discount that, but it's a hard thing to really educate on, especially for the populations that we're talking to are not the populations that that are going to get attacked by this. So what happens is, at least in my opinion, it's the responsibility of the industry across the board to be putting in best practices that people can use, that people that are really protective, that remove some of these vulnerabilities for remote attack. I really do feel like it's a responsibility on all of us to
Mhm.
put these practices in place, especially for those people who, I'd love to educate people to use the proper password links and all that sort of stuff, but you're just never going to get there. It's just not going to happen.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you can talk to anybody who gives, who's spent money on, having an expert come in and give a anti-phishing seminar to their
Yeah.
workforce. It just never works. We have the data. We know you can't teach people not to do this, because the fact is, you don't expect a text from a verified phone number, or like not a verified phone number, a compromised phone number
Yeah.
from, a relative asking for money. It's an emotional thing. And that's why identity is the threat vector here. It's not really the locked down systems. People aren't banging against hardened security of the banks. They're attacking the people because the people are softer, easier to get into. We're talking a lot about how things are right now, but it seems like most of the pieces rather, sorry, are in place for us to move away from passwords. So my question is, what makes pure biometric authentication such a difficult ideal to achieve?
Yeah. And I think, well, there are lots of nuanced ways to look at it, I think, but I think ultimately it comes down to things like account recovery, like that, exactly what you said. Sitting underneath that biometric is a person. And yeah, I just think that being able to, like, if I lose my phone, or if something goes wrong, like, I know that there's hesitance on a lot of users' parts to fully rely on those types of systems, because we talked about it before, even with passwords. It's like, it's the way it's always worked. I just know how to use it, and it's like, why me? Like, you have a lot of friction in the belief cycle, if you will, like getting people to like really believe in it. But yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge, is just getting people to adopt it, and then understand what an account recovery process looks like. Because if I'm relying on this thing, right, this is, we talk about this all the time. This is the probably the best proxy that we're going to have for a user, kind of between the physical and the digital world, right? But I'm not going to carry this exact piece of hardware for my entire life. I'm going to move devices. I'm going to, I might switch from, iOS to Android, or Android to iOS, or, if somebody else finally decides that they can compete with Google and Apple in that space, I might switch to that, So it's, I think that movement is always going to be a challenge. And I think it's something that pops up in people's minds. It's like, well, if I got rid of my password, well, what does that mean? Like, how do I get into my stuff when I need it? And usually those moments in time, like if I lose my phone, that's a time when like I need access to all that stuff. You know what I mean? So.
Exactly. Well, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the current situation. We've been talking about the problems, but I think, at this point, it'd be nice to like show people what the future could be like, because if people can see it, then they can start adopting it. So let's sort of look ahead to this passwordless future. What are the essential components of a passwordless access and identity ecosystem? I know it's a big question, but
everything. We need everything. I think, but if you're kind of boiling it down to kind of the key components, let's say, I do think that this is one of them, right? The proliferation of smartphones has been a game changer in the identity and access space. The fact that I have a proxy for you that is a pretty strong representation of you in the digital world, like being able to rely on that, I think is really important. But there's the flip side, identity and authentication, and this is how this may be overly simplistic, but this is just kind of how I process it, is like those two are the core elements that work in concert in any sort of customer journey in this space, right? You start with your identity verification event. So I come and I try to sign up for an account. I got to say, hey, I'm Bill Fish. And here's whether it's proof that I'm Bill Fish or some method for a business to understand, okay, I'm talking to Bill Fish right now, right? But then the other piece of that is I now have to establish credentials to then continue to prove that I'm Bill Fish without having to go through an identity verification event every single time I want to access my money, my services, whatever it might be. So what's kind of a critical element to that is the establishment of credentials as close to the identity verification as possible, and preferably through the same channel, right? So if I'm on my mobile phone, I want to complete that verification event and then establish my passwordless credential to then use in the third step, which is the ongoing authentication flows, right? That's your just normal day-to-day, I'm logging in, trying to do stuff, right? But what is always going to happen is I'm upgrading this thing to the latest and greatest. What happens then? And that is essentially, it brings you full circle back to an identity verification event for maybe rebinding of a new device. Now, there are clever ways to use existing credentials on other places to kind of triangulate on a new device, but ultimately what you're doing is I'm showing up on a new device and I'm trying to claim I'm Bill Fish now on this thing. Well, how do we then prove that you are you on that new device? So, without getting too deep into what we do, I think that's one of Prove's strengths in particular is being able to establish identity on a new device to then be able to kind of re-enter that life cycle. So essential components, I think, are the device itself, a secure mobile device with the secure element or the trusted execution environment, called a whole bunch of different things, but like, essentially secure hardware on the phone, protected by strong biometrics, and account recovery and identity binding and account recovery flows. Like that whole system has to work in concert, in my mind, to be a legitimately passwordless experience. Basically, when we say passwordless, we're just trying to take KBA really out of the equation, right? So
absolutely, yeah. I mean, that circle that you just illustrated there, I think is really important for people to understand as well. And it's really great that you talked about generational identity, because the last thing you want is to have just be leaving behind a whole bunch of identities with your old phones, and then re-enrolling every time. Like that does not solve any problems. In fact, it causes a whole bunch of other ones, immediately when I think about it. But what you were just describing there, at Fund Biometrics, we sort of refer to that as the trust chain. So when you're talking about binding a credential to a user when you're doing the identity verification, we call that a trust anchor. And then every subsequent continuous authentication, that's a link in the chain. And we like to try to illustrate to people that your entire system is only as secure as the weakest link in that chain, because this is sort of a tautology in our industry. 100% of fraud happens within an authenticated session. And so if one of your links is very, is reliant on KBA and it gets in, it doesn't matter if you enrolled in a biometric, that person's still using your identity to commit fraud. So that's all sort of the precursor to me asking, what role does interoperability play in maintaining the integrity of a trust chain when we're talking about moving into this future that you just described?
Yeah, and I think you can look at interoperability in a couple of different ways. I think, if I'm kind of getting at what you're asking, it's kind of like, back to the conversation around Google and Apple is kind of holding a little bit of a duopoly on this space, with maybe Microsoft coming in from the side with desktop machines, and I will commend Microsoft for being one of the early, for lack of a better phrase, pushers of the capability, right? Through Windows Hello and what they've been doing. So I've appreciated that. But fact of the matter is, people, as much as Apple or Google or Microsoft would love people to be in their ecosystem and only in their ecosystem, that's just not how the world works. Mm-hmm. And I, as a business, if I'm on the business side, like, I can't count on a user doing that, right? Like an example that's probably sign up with Apple. Like, okay, well, as a user, like, well, what happens if I change to an Android device? I actually don't know. Like, what happens to my account? Do I need to set up a new account? Like all this stuff. So this is where I think the statement that Google, Apple, and Microsoft made around passkeys is important, right? That they've committed to both being somewhat interoperable as well as support for the capability kind of going forward. I think that's really important. But I need to be able to link together in a consistent framework my Mac computer with my Android phone or my Windows laptop, and like what you're saying is, like, you're creating a chain of trust, and there's a lot of strength to that. But this is where, at least from, I would say, one of Proof's core premises is that the mobile device is probably like the strongest one that is you, closest to you. And there's a lot of there's a lot of capability around verifying your identity around that device that may not be as much on like shared devices. Like my laptop might be shared with the family, right? My iPad, same thing. So, the chain of trust is important, but this is just my opinion, not every piece of that chain is created equal. But they need to be able to talk to each other. Really, to address your question specifically, you need to be able to have frameworks where trust can be conferred from different ecosystems, really. And that's where, again, my opinion, I think that the teams who've been working on FIDO and WebAuthn in particular have really been thinking through that challenge, and I think there is hope in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's good to hear, because when we talk about, I think when we traditionally talk about a user's responsibility in their identity, a lot of it sort of does get funneled into, it's like, oh, it's your fault if you're not aware of phishing. It's your fault for not updating your 50 to 60 different passwords on 50 to 60 different websites with 50 to 60 different usernames. But really, it's like, that is the interoperability thing is something that is actually out of the end user's control. And it is great to see that people are collaborating in order to make sure that there is integrity across the ecosystem.
Yeah, well, I just to piggyback off that for a second, though, I think what you said is really important. It's easy to blame victims, right? To blame the users and say they didn't do it. But and I hopefully this comes across the right way. But really, if you're offering a service digitally, it's your responsibility as much as it's, if not more than your user, right? To use systems that are going to be easy to use, that are protective, and to put those protections in place for them. I mean, that's the expectation of your user. That's the expectation of, not to make it, too wide, but of society at large, like for us all to kind of like, to participate in systems that actually protect people and not not basically blame the vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. Here. I mean, I've had, in the earlier days, I've had, products sent to me, and I've, for review, and I've been like, look, I can't set this up. And then, I've been blamed, and I've been like, well, I don't know what to tell you, man.
Yeah.
I'm working in this industry. If you want to sell this at a store,
Yeah.
I don't know how my parents are going to set it up,
Yeah.
but yeah. So, but that's an aside here. We're talking about a lot of things. You mentioned passkeys. You mentioned everything's going on at FIDO. You've alluded to some of what Prove does. It sounds like a lot of this is here. How close are we, do you think, to approaching a post-password reality?
I have my optimistic take and my pessimistic take on this.
We can hear both. Yeah.
I think what you alluded to is important. Like the ingredients now exist for us to move well beyond passwords for most users. And the pessimistic side is there will be passwords will be with us for a very long time, as a piece of the pie. But our goal now isn't like, I think we like to talk in, and I hate to call it a platitude, but hopefully you get what I mean, right? We want the password reality to be here, but what we're really doing is trying to reduce the vector of attack. And there are going to be some people who just always want to hold on to that. And now at some point you can kind of force people to do it, but most businesses are not unless identity authentication is like their core element. They're about allowing their users to use their service, right? So putting up those barriers to do that, to me, it's almost more now of a business question than it is a technology question. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce that piece of the pie that's reliant on passwords. And then what you can do is you can focus your efforts on that population as it begins to narrow, right? So I would love to say that 2 years we'll be done, like everybody will be using the most secure methods, but really passwords will be with us for a very long time, as a hopefully a niche,
Absolutely. I mean, you know what? Like, it's refreshing to hear a realistic take like that, because it is an important reality. And the fact is, we've already talked about it, underneath a digital identity is a real human identity, and people are free to choose things even if it's not their best thing.
Things, and like some people just like, it's not just like, I think a lot of times in our minds we use the example of my mother, my grandmother, whatever that is, but there are plenty of people my age who are like, I ain't got time for this. You know what I mean? They're like, you know what, I got way too much in my life. This is not something I'm going to spend a lot of time worried about, which is why it's incumbent upon us to worry about it and to try to come up with better ways to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, we don't want to start any generational wars. I'm a member of the millennial generation. I know countless people who are just as bad as my parents and aunts and uncles, etc. No generation war here. But when it does start to happen, when we do start to see this uptake, we've been talking quite a bit about general consumers here, but we know that this is going to happen. Like you said, this is more of a business problem than a technology problem at this point. So which markets do you expect to be the first to go passwordless?
Yeah, no, this is a difficult question, I think, to answer, because the way you would analyze it, or way you look at it, is to say, okay, well, the industries where user protection is like super important, like money, like anytime there's money involved, I think we've seen a lot of despite its some of the inherent other sort of business problems, but crypto is a great space for, like, there's an opportunity to put some things in place that help protect users in a much more secure way. And you have a user base who is already a little bit more geared towards, technology adoption, if you want to call it that, right? But I do think fintech, I do think banking, as much as banks have a tendency to be, they're massive ships that take a long time to move. I do think that's a space where it's like the potential fraud fighting benefits and the potential protective benefits could give a bank who moves in this direction a unique advantage to say, we're the most protective of our customers. I've got lots of industries that I would love to see do it. Like, even healthcare is probably another one. Basically anywhere where, you may not have authentications as frequently, this type of thing helps a lot. Like if you even think about the remembering my password type of scenario, like I hate to admit it, I don't log into my healthcare providers, experiences all that often. A couple times a year, am I trying to reset my password like every single time? Like,
Yeah, exactly. Using that those account recovery options is always a stark reminder of how far some industries have to go.
Absolutely. And I would love to see gaming, especially moving this space, because I do think there's being, I will say I like to say I'm on the edge of being a millennial. Like I'm on the borderline. It depends on who you ask, right? But I do spend a lot of time, gaming as well. And there's a lot of time and people's investment in that. I think it's a space where you can, make things more secure and easier to use. So anyway, things like
absolutely. That. I mean, I share your enthusiasm for that. Every time there's a new console, there's always rumors that they're going to start having biometric authentication for stores. But there have been large console, virtual marketplace hacks that have happened. Not to mention you have all of your financial information in there. And there's a lot of identity and relationships. It's a great vector for phishing. I don't want to give any bad actors looking for tips. Any tips?
Good point.
But it's also a great, it's a great industry as well for that kind of uptick, just because it doesn't necessarily have the same stringent regulations as the other examples we had. Banking and healthcare, it would be a lot easier to implement this on a gaming platform. So anyway, excited about that. We're getting close to the end here, but before we go, I want to give some actionable advice to viewers watching right now. The password problem, it's persistent, it's here. Instead of waiting for this future and waiting for the business adoption, what steps can viewers take to protect their organizations from hackers, like right now?
Yeah, it's my opinion that that you should not let perfect be the enemy of good. Right? Any 2FA is better than no 2FA, really. I know SMS OTPs have gotten a bad rap, and somewhat rightfully so. There's a lot of vulnerabilities there, but it's literally better than nothing. Like I'd rather, again, like it's not perfect, but it's better. And there are tools to help help SMS OTPs become more secure, depending on depending on the vertical and the need for protection. So, I mean, that's where you start. You start with some basic stuff, even using I like what the FIDO Alliance is doing, so I'm a little partial to that. So, there are really straightforward ways to implement kind of some passwordless experiences, even now. You using things like biometric authentication on a device, basically anything that you can do to make life easier and more secure for your users in the short term. But I always say, no matter what, start with 2FA. Do something. Allow users to turn that on and allow users to protect themselves. And once you triage that, then you can start thinking about, well, how do I then build a framework that's going to stand the test of time and really deliver on the promise of passwordless.
Absolutely. Yeah. Step by step, right? That's what it's going to take, but you always just want to do as much as you can.
Yeah, for sure.
Fantastic. Well, Bill, thank you so much. This has been a really fantastic conversation. I think hopefully it's been very educational for our viewers. As one last thing, how can viewers get in touch with Prove to learn more about eliminating passwords?
Yeah, I mean, you start with go to our website, www.prove.com. You can kind of learn about our solutions there, and what we do and how we work in the identity verification through the authentication, that cycle that I was talking about. So, and listen, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn if you want. Like I love talking about this stuff. Probably too much, as my wife would guessed. So, you know, so yeah, feel free to reach out to us. You can get in touch with us via our website as well if you want to learn more about something specific that's there. Otherwise, yeah, be great to hear from people.
Great, fantastic. Well, we'll also keep some links there in the show notes afterward. And thank you again, Bill. I'm really looking forward to seeing how this all develops and hopefully continuing our conversation here in the future. I also love to talk about this stuff, evidently. So thanks again.
Yeah, Peter, it was great being here, and thanks for having me.
Anytime, you're always welcome back here. And also thank you to everyone in the audience for tuning in. This is the end of our webinar. I've been your host, Peter Counter. Thank you again. Until next time, stay secure and stay safe.